It's always a task to close off the conference, to give the last lecture, and so I was thinking about in preparing this talk, taking seriously. So first it seemed more like a topic for the beginning of the conference, and then I thought, well, but maybe at the end it's also a really nice moment to kind of problematize whether we can actually take seriously people with extreme beliefs, and question, so why might it actually be problematic and difficult? And so it's also an invitation to think maybe in our research, but also maybe in our interpersonal relations, in the political context, and as practitioners, whether taking seriously is something we do, and what the uses of it are. So I'll first, or some remarks. So I think, so I'll just refer to extremists and extreme believers, and I mean persons in fundamentalist groups, extremist groups, so the things that we have been discussing, conspiracy theory groups, terrorists, or persons who are just generally radicalized and fanatic. And I won't be talking about why we need it. So I just assume, okay, suppose in some contexts we need it, then how can we actually do it? What would it mean to take seriously extreme believers? So I'll first give some preliminary remarks about taking seriously and the subjectivity of extreme believers, then turn to the obstacles, and then I'll kind of pose like what I think is the problem for taking seriously, and then I'll turn to listening and openness and how that might solve the problem. So first, we use the word, the idiom, in many ways, right? So there's not one thing we're going to mean by taking seriously. So it's not, I'm not giving a philosophical analysis of taking seriously, like this is what we must mean with it at all times. They're just really different things we mean by it. But in the dictionary, we do find a kind of general statement, and that is seeing and treating something or someone as important and as worthy of attention and respect. Now, this gives us some information, but not that much, because if you think about it, then of course, if you want to take something seriously, you give it attention, and also it seems that that it involves respect. But these are just notions that we need to explain as well. So I think that this giving attention and giving respect to someone or something are just more generic notions of, and so taking seriously is a form of giving attention, and taking seriously is a form of giving respect to someone. So this definition doesn't really help us either. And then there are so many elements of subjectivity that we can take seriously about extremists. And so Nora and I just gave a course on understanding others across difference. And Nora came with his app, Miro. I don't know if you know it, but you can do a lot of stuff with it. Also, this. So what is it about others that we can understand? So you don't need to read it, to be able to read everything, but you can think about the behavior and then the justification of behaviors, or the patterns and structures of the behavior, the external cues, internal cues. But you can also think about the psychology, the attachment style, the emotional makeup, the trauma someone has, or their experience, or their feelings, their perceptions, their identity, their roles, their standpoints, the different worlds in which that they inhabit. You can think about the context, the structural inequality, political environment, epistemic environment, the culture, or their relations. Are they healthy, unhealthy? What kind of responsibilities do they have? Their perspective, what's their worldview, their background frameworks, epistemic, moral frameworks, and also their positionality, their social location, marginalization. So, and this is not meant to be exhaustive. So that's, I think, one thing we've also seen at the conference, that we can focus on many different things when we think about taking seriously the subjectivity of extreme believers. Now, you can also think about each of the things I just mentioned. There are also many aspects you can inquire. So if we just focus on belief, so suppose we look at Jacobine's view that the school system should prepare youngsters for a revolution. So this was a view that was part of Jacobinism. Now you might think, okay, we can engage with just the content of the view. Or we can also engage and just criticize it, for instance. Or we can also engage with Jacobine's reasons for holding the view. Now, a third thing that we might engage is why such reasons appeal to Jacobin. So we can engage with her worldview and background. And the fourth thing is how Jacobin ended up endorsing this view. So then you would more be interested in the social and causal antecedents of the view. Then we can also do so in many ways. So here's the Miro board again. And the students could also add things to the Miro board. So the arrows are funny additions from the students. So they don't mean anything in this context. But you can think about, okay, we can take them seriously by observation. So ethnography, experiments, registration, but also maybe cognitive or RFID strategies such as imagination, mind reading, empathy, perspective taking. And we can look at their testimony through interviews, written sources, through dialogue, listening, or biographical material. And then we can take seriously with different aims. So I think there are many more aims. I'm going to highlight two. So the first is to advance truth, knowledge, and justification. And this can be in relation to an individual's view, but also kind of to the collective. So to improve the information that we share and rely on, and to protect it from influences such as misinformation or propaganda. And you can think of, okay, if we want to take seriously with the aim of advancing truth, knowledge, and justification, then the default mode is critical and open-minded engagement. And so the idea here is that you focus on arguments, on reasons, and you want to evaluate this, so it's going to be critical, but also open-mindedness. And what can we conceive as open-mindedness? So here are some aspects. So maybe a willingness to follow the argument where it leads, but also taking challenges to one's beliefs seriously, and a willingness to make room for novel ideas and give them serious consideration. Now, a second aim of taking seriously is understanding the other, which we've also heard at the conference. And here's a quote by Daniel Hutto. It's just from a manuscript, but so he writes, "Simply in seeking to understand our interlocutors' reasons, we show some measure of our respect for them. Such inquiry shows that we regard them as beings of worth, as someone who has some reason for finding the views they propound attractive. When we hear another out in a civil manner, we show them the respect of taking them seriously. Moreover, we can achieve this much even if we already firmly believe that the position they are advancing is deeply, inherently flawed, problematic, or even repugnant." So here, the idea is that we move from learning from the views of the person we engage with to learning about their views. And that might also be a way of taking them seriously. It's responding to their worth as rational beings, as beings whose orientation is based on reasons. And if we do this, it also fosters learning about their views and their worldview, and perhaps also their subjective rationality, so how their views and their reasons might be consistent. So in this way we can learn about the person behind the views and about their circumstances. So this is another way of looking at this is also that understanding the other, we cannot just, to take them seriously, we need to engage with their views. Why is this? Well, because we are all situated. So the idea is that we cannot just suppose that we know other perspectives or that I can imagine other perspectives because we're all situated. So our background, social position, and experience partly determine our perspective. So we need this information from within to get to know, to get to understand the perspectives. So then the question, why might taking extremists seriously be a problem? If it's such a broad thing, then sure, we can do it in one way or another. And so I don't want to go into too much detail. We can talk, I think, a lot more about whether open-minded engagement, critical engagement, is something we can do. But I think there are, and we've heard that as well, that there are good reasons against it. So it can be irrational, immoral, but also infeasible. So, and one thing that might be a way to see that is that if you think about open-mindedness as a willingness to follow the argument where it leads, obviously we're not going to do this with just every argument that we come across. So here the idea is that the argument needs to be relevant or significant. You cannot just take on board or seriously engage with just anything you come across. There needs to be relevance or significance. There needs to be some a reason to actually get into an argument. And you might wonder, well, maybe we should shift to close-minded engagement. And so, I think, but this is maybe we can come back to this in the discussion. But I think that close-minded engagement, if critical engagement is aimed at advancing truth and advancing justification, then actually if you say before the engagement, okay, but but you don't have a part in determining what is truth or what is justified, then that's actually not a part of taking them seriously. So there might be reasons to close-mindedly engage with extreme believers, but I don't think it's a way of taking them seriously. So then we might think, okay, so let's just take them seriously to understand them. But here you already saw that in the quote by Hutto that he says, yeah, okay, but we just find their reasons repugnant, but we still try to engage with them. And so I think there's a tension, and this is something that I'm going to argue for, that there's this tension between taking seriously a person and already judging their views to be wrong. So this is a tension, and I don't think we can change that. So I think we are entitled to judge that their views are wrong, but then how to solve the tension. So here are, I think, is a way to make this problem more concrete or extend on this problem. So I think there are kind of three interlocking obstacles. So one is the labeling of persons and groups as extreme or as fundamentalist or as extremist. The other are deep disagreements, and the other is the us versus them dynamic. So first, the labels related to extreme beliefs, fundamentalism, extremism, are not innocent categorizations. So first, there are social labels, so they have social reality. They apply to groups, to social movements, ideologies, but they're also normative. So if you apply the label, you minimally say, okay, this belief is far from the mainstream, but often it actually means this belief is irrational or even vile. So you actually denounce the belief or perspective. And the interesting thing is that extreme beliefs are often actually precisely trying to question the grounds for, or our epistemic and moral frameworks. And so we actually often apply the label because the belief falls outside of our accepted epistemic and moral frameworks. And so one way to look at this is, I think, in the philosophical tradition of pragmatism, I think helps to clarify this point. So I've already said, okay, we're all situated. There are multiple perspectives, and we cannot know these perspectives from the outside. And for pragmatism, these are two crucial features of democracy, and they argue that, so for instance, Richard Rorty argues that as a consequence, we cannot actually, in democracy, appeal to an absolute truth from a neutral vantage point. So he says we have to negotiate with our community what counts as justification. So in democracy, we have to negotiate with each other what counts as justification, what counts as true. And Rorty claims that this relates directly to taking seriously. So for him, the division between who is and is not taken seriously dovetails actually with the distinction between who is and is not included in that community of justification. Now, you can think about how are these two questions intertwined if you think about experience. And so if you think about appeals to experience, then Rorty says they rely upon a predisposition on the part of the community to take such appeals seriously. So an example, are women who convey that they experience sexual harassment at work allowed their depiction of the situation? Or is their depiction of the situation called into question by ascribing to them, for instance, a condition that distorts their experience of the situation? So calling women too fragile or not humorous enough. And similarly, you might think that the question of whether the experience of angry white men who feel that their jobs and familiar surroundings are endangered by emancipation, globalization, and immigration is to be taken seriously is related to the question, which experience should be accounted for in our justificatory practices? So here we see that an account of taking seriously needs to address the relation to exclusion or inclusion in our justification practices. Now, if we think again about the epistemic and moral framework, so I said a little bit about how extreme beliefs often question the dominant epistemic and moral frameworks. And in social epistemology, you have the term deep disagreements. And here, the idea is that you can have normal disagreements, but then you can still find common ground and relate to each other's reasons. But when disagreements are deep, the disagreeing parties adhere actually to different moral and epistemic frameworks. And so this means that you adhere to different sources, different experts, different facts, different principles, and different values. And this means that there's no common ground to start this discussion. And the idea is often also that if you do discuss, then you actually might also get more alienated from each other because you just don't see the other's contributions to the discussion as valuable contributions or as contributions that make sense. And in the philosophical debate, that's mostly focused on, okay, these deep disagreements are problematic if you are one another's peer. So if you're peers, then maybe having a deep disagreement with someone who is in the same position as you to have been able to gather evidence and to have thought about the issue, then you should lower your confidence in your own views. Now, with extreme believers, the deep disagreement works differently, right? We don't feel that we are each other's peers. Instead, we are saying, but our epistemic and moral frameworks are superior to your epistemic and moral frameworks. So in the case of extreme beliefs, such deep disagreements seem to lead to this idea of superiority. Oh yeah. So this brings us to the us versus them. So it's present in the it's present in the first obstacle of labeling. You label the other person as extreme. It's present in the deep disagreement. It's their moral and epistemic frameworks are inferior. But it goes beyond that. So here's a quote by Roxanne Uben. She's a scholar of fundamentalism. She is in comparative political theory. And I think this captures nicely what this is about. So our scholarly categories and narratives at once express and reproduce particular historical and cultural assumptions about the world. These post-Cold War theses revealed anxieties and presuppositions at work in the intersection of Western social scientific scholarship and Islamic fundamentalism in particular. Such anxieties in part originate in and are exacerbated by the cultural distance and historical antagonism between East and West, between what's understood to be us and Islam. So you see here that it's that here the Islamic fundamentalism is excluded, or the Islam is excluded from this community of justification. So this is kind of the epistemic level, but obviously there's also a social and political reality in which this us versus them dynamic takes place. So it has further consequences, such as othering, objectifying, and stigmatizing. And I wanted to share with you the work of Alison Liebling. So she's a prison researcher. And so she's done a lot of research in prisons and with interviews with the prisoners, but also with the guards. And at a certain point in time, she got the question from the Ministry of Justice in the United Kingdom, whether she could do research in a prison and see whether the prisoners are radicalizing. And she was here at the conference last year that Nora and I organized about communication across difference. And she said, well, the atmosphere in this prison was really tense. And she says, this was really a difficult thing to do, to even start this research. So she said, well, this question actually already puts a wall between the prisoners, the research subjects, and you, the researcher. And so she really felt that this question itself was already very othering. And then she said, well, the whole atmosphere in this prison was tense. It was not just the prisoners who seemed radicalized. It seemed that the whole atmosphere was radicalized. So the prison itself and also the guards seemed to be radicalized. So it was full of distrust. It was full of fear and anger. And the guards were only thinking about risk. And they were objectifying and othering the prisoners. And they only felt distrust towards prisoners. And the prisoners were only met with suspicion and unfair treatment and got angrier and angrier. So she wondered, is this a situation where I can still do research? So the whole idea of research where we can craft some form of objectivity. And so she thought maybe this form of objectivity, I just cannot master this in this tense situation. So we might wonder whether in some circumstances there's too much distrust, too much polarization, too much differences to cross this gap between us and them and to seek actually understanding of the other. So we've seen these three interlocking problems: the labeling, the deep disagreement, and the us versus them. And so this is, I think, brings us to, my idea of the problem of taking others seriously. So on the one hand, taking seriously kind of implies that you include someone in your practices of justification. But we actually call people extremists because they fall outside these practices of justification. So calling them extremists is excluding them from practices of justification. So there's this tension between taking extremists seriously and including or excluding someone in a discussion about what counts as normative justification. And now the question is, how can we deal with this? And here I want to explore the notion of listening and openness. So we go from open-mindedness to openness. And so if we remember what Hutta proposed, so just hearing someone out about their reasons while already dismissing them, basically. So let's say this involves a kind of listening. It might even be active listening. It might even be empathetic listening, but still the listening is just merely focused on gathering information about the other person from the inside. So this is what we may do when we take the writings and speeches of terrorists literally, as Cassam proposed, or by gathering first-person data of extreme believers. Or you can think about what a journalist might be doing, or a detective, when they just want to take note of another person's reasons. And also maybe, I mean, this is not the only thing that data scientists or psychologists do, but maybe also what data scientists or psychologists may be doing when they try to fit the other person in a predetermined category or label. Now, I think when we focus only on this information, we face problems. And I'm going to refer to a paper by Joseph Beatty. He wrote a paper on good listening. So it's a long quote, but I think it's nice. So the good listener necessarily calls on her cultural, social, emotional, and imaginative fund of experience, her sense of self, of the world, of value, and of how conventions and relations ordinarily work. What, in fact, it means to focus on or attend to the other's communication is to focus or attend with something like this orientation, this sense of the real and ordinary, the factual, relevant, normal, and normative that is encompassed in what I am calling the good listener's orientation. And this can be questioned, denied, revised, and affirmed by the enterprise of listening. To speak of the inescapability of orientation in referring to the attentiveness of the good listener is perhaps only to acknowledge what is obvious. Good listening, like almost everything else, is situated, and the particular or general elements evoked by its situatedness can enable and retard understanding. So in this listening that Hutta describes, there's no attentiveness to this orientation. There's no recognition that its orientation of the person who is listening might actually do something to what the other person is trying to convey, and do something to what you try to understand. Sorry, I'm going to say a little bit more. So there are the ideas that in your perspective, if you are situated and your orientation plays a role in how you understand the other, then obviously we have problems. There are distorting pressures in our orientation that actually distort what the meaning of the other. So you can think about biases, prejudice, but also active ignorance, what we know from the epistemic injustice literature, testimonial injustice. So the difficulty in understanding the other are distorting pressures from one's own situated perspective. And obviously these distorting pressures are also present in society and in research. So they're present in in how extreme believers are represented in the media, but also in research and also in the history, in history. So in Hutto, the example from Hutto that you can just listen to someone else's reasons and then understand those reasons, in the case when perspectives are different, and especially when there are radical differences in perspective, this is quite problematic to just suppose that you have this kind of neutral view, that you can just come to see these reasons as they are without questioning your own perspective. So I think we need to go to kind of listening across difference. And this includes 3 dimensions of openness. So 3 ways of dealing with these distorting pressures. So first is in listening, the second in language, and the third is in context. So what can we do in listening? Now, how do you deal with these distortions? So the idea is that in the activity of listening, you don't just think that you are a neutral vat where you can just, the words of the other can just fall in and you understand them, but instead you question your own responses and constructions of the other. So for instance, if someone tells you an experience and your immediate response is one of dismissal or downgrading, then you can confront this initial response. Or you can ask, what social norms do I actually rely on that I dismiss this experience? Are my sensitivities to what the other tries to convey and their background sufficiently developed? Or the question, in what world do we actually need to live that this experience would be seen as legitimate? So you kind of try to transcend this initial response and to find out about things about your own perspective that influence how this experience or how the words of the other are perceived and received. Now, obviously, this is a kind of tricky project because many of these distorting pressures are automatic, they might be unconscious, but this is exactly why in the encounter with the other, you might actually try to find out about them. So the idea is not that as a consequence you will suddenly arrive at a neutral description of the other's words or the other's account, but that you will at least counter these distorting pressures. So that uncovering these distorting pressures is part of the practice. So what this needs is an openness to question one's own interpretation and confront the influence of one's own situatedness. And one thing this also leads to is that you kind of see the complexity of other persons, or that it could lead to. So here's another quote by BT. So good listening then, in its openness, rooted in detachment, represents a refusal to yield to impulses to reduce self or other, and is positively an acknowledgement of human complexity, of the ever-present possibility that individuals may be other than they have been or been recognized to be. And so here's I wanted to shortly go to the example of Shamima Begum. So I think many of you have heard of her, but she was 15 when she traveled to ISIS, spent 4 years there, and then when she was 19, turned up at a refugee camp. And there at the refugee camp, she was immediately interviewed by journalists, And she said things like, or she was questioned, do you have remorse? Do you have regrets? And she was like, no, I have no regrets. I have no remorse. And this kind of haunted her until this day, and so she's denied UK citizenship. And she's still in the refugee camp. And in a sense, I think this is really a way of kind of essentializing that what she said in this particular situation is just essential to what she is as a person, for instance. And so if you know more about her background, then she had 2 children when she was in ISIS. They both died of hunger. She walked several days to get to the refugee camp. She was highly pregnant. And then, yeah, so why did no one ask, like, what does she even mean by saying, I have no remorse or no regrets? So why did she say it like this? What did she mean by this? And is it actually essential to who she is, or is it a statement in a specific context and a specific time? And I mean, I don't know her, right? So I don't know the answers to these questions. But it's just, yeah, this is just, I think, an example of how persons are reduced to something, to kind of an object instead of a subject who changes over time or also seeks understanding herself. Okay, so the second one, in language. So here the idea is that, well, maybe we need discourse awareness. And obviously this is also that comes from the hermeneutical tradition. So the fact that we are situated does not just pose a problem for information, that we have no information about the other perspective, but also a problem of lack of shared vocabulary. So the meaning of what we say depends on our lived experience, on our conceptual horizons, on our worldviews. So the implication of this is that the vocabulary of the person who takes seriously the extreme believer may distort the meaning of the things that the other person shares. So you might say, okay, we need to take our own vocabulary into account when we try to understand the other person, and we need discourse awareness. And here's 2 ways in which we might attend to the discourse. And one is heteroglossic attunement, so it's from a paper by Vader-Boncoeur et al. And she says heteroglossic attunement involves recognizing, attending to, and inquiring into the plurality of voices and perspectives in the communication of others and institutions, as well as in our own utterances. So it's not that, so the idea is that the words we use and the meaning of them is not just what we want them to mean, right? But that they have a history and that there are multiple meanings present and multiple voices present in these words. And also in the groups that we try to, so in other people that we try to understand, there are multiple voices and perspectives, but also in the groups that we try to understand, there are always multiple voices and perspectives present. And the second one is lexical awareness. So lexical awareness extends to the power of using particular names and labels to categorize groups of people, and through the choice of and meaning made of nouns, as when groups of behaviors or people or cultures are labeled. Words shape how the ideas and reasons shared in communities of inquiry are heard and how they affect others, including the judgments involved in deciding what to inquire into, seek to clarify, reflect upon, and potentially trouble. So the idea is that, okay, we need, if we want to understand and persons across radical differences, then we need to attend to discourse, to the different voices that are present in our words, but also in how the words we use actually change what can happen and what we inquire into, what matters or what is seen as of value. So the third is context. So I wanted to return to Liebling's example. So here, the thing is that the idea is that we need awareness of context and how our social and political positions might facilitate and might distort how we listen to the other and how we can understand the other. And so Liebling said, can I do research in this situation? And for Liebling, this was the prison itself, where there was this tension and this polarization between the guards and the prisoners. But you might also think about this more in general terms about the field of terrorism and radicalization studies, for instance, where, as we just heard in Maynard's talk, about the secularization and the security language might actually have a lot of influence on the us-them dynamic and whether we can actually seek understanding of the other. But she also asked more questions. So she said, am I actually the right person to do this research? So a lot of the prisoners converted to Islam, and this conversion was also immediately met with suspicion. And she just doesn't have a background in religious study or in Islam studies, or herself a religious background. So she was really wondering, do I have the right repertoire to understand the other's subjectivity? And she also thought of the question, like, who can study whom? Like, if you want to get in an authentic or legitimate matter, so if you really want to understand the meaning of what the other says, who can then understand, who can study whom? And she wondered, so can we actually build a common world of meaning across difference? And can I still trust my skills and intuitions in a place that's so tense? So she really felt, she also started to feel fear. And she just didn't feel like she could still rely on her trained intuitions and trained skills as a researcher. And in the end she says, well, maybe we should actually also change the question. So maybe we should change, not ask anymore, is radicalization still, are prisoners radicalizing, but what are the different forms of anger that are there? And a reason that she says she wants to do is to make it easier to actually return to what there is and to just see what's going on. So she's referring to this tradition of the thick description, which was started by anthropologist Geertz. And the same is actually you can also see in the research by Roxanne Euban. So she also says, well, fundamentalism is often just seen as a response to modernism, and anti-modern. And then she says, well, but that is not an isolated phenomenon, right? Maybe we should compare it to other critiques of modernism. And if we compare it to other critiques of modernism, this actually gives us something to relate to. So this is also Liebling's point. So if we just focus on anger, this is something we can relate to. If you focus only on radicalization, this will always be something that only the other has. Okay. So, to the conclusions. So, what I argued is actually that if we start from the idea that we are situated beings and that we cannot just know other person's perspective without actually asking them, then we need openness to take them seriously. So the question is, how can I, as the one taking seriously, deal with my own situatedness and the distortions that follow from that? And so we move actually just from only learning about the other to a place where we try to learn with the other. So we try to learn with the other about the situatedness of the extreme believer, but also about our own situatedness. And so I argued that we need three forms of awareness. So one is in listening, awareness of our own responses and of our own, and to question our own responses and interpretation. The other is to question our discourse. And the third is to question the positionality and the context and power or the power in the context. And so I think that we need this kind of openness where we have a willingness to question our own questions, our presuppositions, our differences and similarities, our words, our responses and interpretations, to uncover the distorting pressures of cognition, language and context. Now, do I now solve the tension that the problem with taking seriously that I formulated? So I said, well, the big problem with taking seriously someone with a radical different perspective or an extreme believer is that in taking seriously, you won't actually want to include someone in community of justification, but by calling someone, by labeling someone as an extremist or an extreme believer, you actually exclude them from the community of justification. So taking the other seriously implies engaging with criticism? No. Does it imply questioning one's own moral and epistemic frameworks? No, maybe at a later stage, but not initially. At least that's how I set it up. But it might mean questioning exclusionary epistemic practices, and especially what are the grounds for including or excluding, or for excluding someone, or excluding certain experiences, or certain descriptions of experiences from this community, or from the justificatory practices. And secondly, also by trying to resist the consequences of excluding someone from this community of justification. So so that taking seriously might actually be a way to counteract the consequences of excluding. So to still give them a voice, or still have a way of relating to their experiences. And the fourth thing is, which is I think also a thing that you can try to resist, is that you don't reduce the other to a stigma or a group, to just one particular ideology or one particular perspective, but that you see the complexity of the other individual, but also group, as an experiencing subject in multiple contexts and changing. So, I now wanted to share some implications and also some ideas maybe that relate to other stuff that we've discussed during the conference. So one thing is, I've said a lot of things that we need to do when we take seriously someone with an extreme belief. So is this difficult? Yes, I think this is difficult. What can we learn from that? So one thing is maybe, well, we really need interdisciplinary research, right? We need people who work on our discourse. We need people who do the interviews. We need people who work on the context or in prisons. And another thing is that follows is that I think that it will be slow. That taking others seriously or taking extreme believers seriously is something that's slow, that we cannot do in a haste, which is obviously what we actually want, because we want to solve the problems of society and of the world. But yeah, I'm afraid that taking seriously will be a slow process. And another thing is that, so what I've tried to show is how attention to difference, and so to the situatedness and how the situatedness of the extreme believer and the person taking seriously differs, that this can be kind of constructive. in the sense that it doesn't need to lead to, doesn't only need to lead to more alienation or more polarization, but if you actually focus on the difference, and perhaps with curiosity, then it can also be something constructive. And obviously, there are a lot of more questions here, like, okay, does this need to be reciprocal, for instance? What kind of context will this work? So this is obviously a question. So when and how to actually then do this? So that's the value and usefulness of taking seriously, and also in which context. So in the research context, this seems more like something we really need to do in this way. But how does it translate to more practical context, for instance? Now, another thing that follows is that we might need to think about what kind of understanding we are aiming at. So we've heard sometimes, okay, we need this full understanding of the other person's perspectives, and we cannot reach this. So this is, and that this was a problem. But you can also think about, well, but if understanding differences is the goal, then you don't need full understanding. Just understanding something more about the situatedness or about the differences already gives us some results. And another point is, okay, can we just determine ourselves when the understanding is reached? Or does this actually, I mean, according to what I've suggested, this actually requires maybe cooperation of the other person that you are taking seriously. So this would be more maybe a dialogical understanding, or at least you need to check with the other person whether your understanding makes sense. And the last thing, so I haven't said so much about empathy or imagination. And I think when you're listening, empathy and imagination always play a role. But the question is, so the problems with empathy and imagination that are discussed in the literature are precisely that this is much easier with people who are like you, and it becomes more and more difficult the more people are dislike you. So what we need for empathy and imagination to work in the right way is precisely this, maybe this recognition of these limits of empathy and imagination. So that empathy and imagination actually, that there's always this, or that there can be this gap, that you cannot know whether you have actually imagined the other person's perspective correctly. And then you would need to listen to them and ask them what their experience actually is. So the idea is that, yeah, we need empathy in listening, but this process of listening across difference actually helps us to get the right kind of, or to help to get the empathy in check. Yeah. So, oh yeah, the last point, it's not on the slide, but was something I was wondering about, and we just discussed with Raphael and Ruth, is that that's also just a general question about the conference, is the way that in philosophy or in our research we use examples and how we choose which examples we focus on. So for instance, Raphael and Cassim focus mainly on a really extreme case where it's really difficult to put yourself in the other person's shoe, or impossible. And then I think Leah pointed out how some of the examples about incels are actually used in philosophy, but then kind of give us a distorted picture of the whole community of incels. And then you might wonder, okay, so how do we decide which are the paradigm examples, for instance, or so do we need actually also, in discussing examples, do we actually also need information from within, whether these, how the persons from the community look at these examples, for instance. Well, so these are just some questions. Let's discuss them, and thank you.